I'm going to welcome you all again. Some of you weren't here this morning, and I would like to congratulate CLT really for, as usual, coming up with a wonderful program. I mean, this morning I was just very proud of what you've been doing, and I was very interested with the panels. And sometimes I feel it's such a shame that it's a one-shot thing, but I'm glad that we are filming this so that other people can have an advantage of it. I have the honor to introduce one of our guest speakers, Dr. Alec Kouros, and we are really very privileged to have him and to have Kathy also, who's going to be keynoting tomorrow. So let me just give you a little bit of an introduction here. I'm going to be reading from the website. Alec is a professor of education technology and media at the Faculty of Education at the University of Regina in Saskatchewan, Canada. An award-winning educator, Dr. Couros helps his undergraduate and graduate students take up the incredible affordances of our connected world through the integration of education technology in teaching and learning. And that's usually a very big challenge as far as I'm concerned. Dr. Couros is also a well-recognized scholar and researcher who has given hundreds of keynotes and workshops around the globe on diverse topics such as connected networked learning, digital citizenship, social media in education, and critical media literacy, providing educators, students, and parents with the knowledge necessary to take advantage of and thrive in our new digital reality. Finally, he is a passionate advocate of openness in education and demonstrates this commitment through his open access publications, considerable digital presence and contributions, and highly successful MOOCs and open boundary courses. I happen to have attended one of your lectures in one of the conferences, and I can tell you he's a very engaging speaker. So please help me welcome Dr. Alec Kouros. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's an absolute honor to be here. I could have sat here all day just to listen to the fine educators sharing their practice today, and that's what this is really about. Getting a chance to celebrate teaching and learning, and I'm thoroughly impressed by the organization and by the CLT, so whatever's happening should continue to happen this way. I'm excited to be able to get a chance to speak with you today. Certainly a little bit nervous. I'm nervous every time I come back. Someone told me if I'm not nervous, I don't care anymore. So I think it's good to be nervous. You've got a good background on me already, but this is me out there. And I'm sort of an academic and non-academic sense. I'm a connected educator. I spend a lot of time on these number of different platforms. And I do this because I feel that I'm a better educator, a better scholar in this way to be connected in different ways. But I also take up, gotta make sure, I'm also an educator. One of the pieces that was highlighted there is I spend a lot of time working with my students to make sure that they understand how to contribute to the web, not just to consume from the web. My students who are undergraduate and graduate educators tend to develop YouTube videos, other types of media to engage with their students, whether they're in practice or whether they're in their practicum. Sorry, I'm just having some trouble clicking here. Also a parent of 4 children. I spend a lot of time, a big part of what I do in that scape is, in that area, is learning more about how they connect to the web. So having a young daughter who's interested in YouTubing, for instance, she's now 8 years old, but she became quite popular on the web when she started to develop makeup tutorials. So she really enjoys, she's very good at it, I think, anyway, for a 4-year-old. She video edits herself, so it's not something that I have to teach her to do. She learned from viewing things online. Her makeup skills aren't as good as her video skills, but she has a great inclination to connect. And it's interesting, at one point in the video, she asked her mother if she tells her mother that she has permission to put this up on Instagram. So I don't know what a 4-year-old's consent means about that, but I think it's kind of an interesting idea. So a big part of this is listening to our students, listening to our kids, understanding that they do have a lot at stake in this area, that their education is at stake, and that the world has changed. And so I'm hoping to tell the story of a little bit about how the world has changed and how at least I'm helping to take on the advantage or take on the challenges of this new world. So there's been three big changes that I typically look at. The first one is the changes in content, and the quality and content that we have access to. I remember working in a small school at one point when I used to scrounge and try my best to actually find all the scarce resources that we had in this tiny school. Today we have so much content that it's overwhelming to even get through. So if we think about the last few years, for instance, going back one here, in 2001, MIT decided to give up all of their content. And that was a really big thing at the time, that for the first time we sort of recognized that content is no longer as valuable as it is. And Charles Vest at the time, I thought his statement was really profound. Our essential value is people and the human experience of faculty working with students in classrooms and laboratories and students learning from each other. This idea that content by itself is not really that important anymore. Then we've seen things like OER, the Open Educational Resource Commons, and of course Creative Commons content across the web. We have seen and mentioned things like edX and Coursera, massive open online courses, and I've been involved in a lot of those as well. But when we actually look at it, even beyond this, I would say that the biggest MOOC out there is probably something like YouTube. I mean, this is where on a regular basis people are asking the question, they want to learn something. Some of it's mundane. If you go to YouTube, learn how to watch, how to dance, how to sing, how to draw. I would probably not learn how to do the splits online, but or in one day, I think I've seen it somewhere else, or learn how to drive. There's certain things that you probably don't want to learn online, but it's interesting to see that people continue to do this and learn from that particular space. And of course, the content out there is quite good. Understanding the quality of content in these spaces, I learn things that I never thought I'd ever learn. I have favorite content creators. So for instance, this is one of my favorite vlogs out there, Smarter Every Day, and it's a scientist by the name of, or engineer by the name of Destin. And what I love about these videos is he asks a simple question at the beginning of every video. In this particular instance, this video, he asked the question like, what would happen if I took a bicycle and I changed the handlebars so if I turned right, the bicycle turns left, and I turn left, the bicycle turns right. And you can see what's happened here. He's created this bicycle to see if he can challenge himself to ride this bike this way. And it's interesting because it's inquiry-driven. What you see here is his challenge to learn how to ride the bicycle and what that actually means. He also does this with his son. While Destin, the guy who developed this, took about 9 months to ride the bicycle, his son took it up in a very quick way. And so if you want to understand neuroplasticity, this is a really great way of understanding that people learn at different rates. And I love this example of him going through it. You can see him struggle through it. He also realized that the moment that he learned how to ride his bicycle the other way, he could no longer ride it the original way. So it's like something snapped in his brain that he couldn't have knowledge. He realized that knowledge doesn't equal understanding. But seeing this sort of thing and getting a chance of how people learn is really great. You see it's passion-based, problem / inquiry-driven. We have examples here of exposure to scientific literacy, and it's accessible. You're learning a lot without actually knowing that you're learning some really important concepts. So YouTube can be a great resource for these types of things. So when we're faced with this phenomena, this idea, everything I learned in college can now be found for free on the internet. This is what some students lament, and now this is more of a meme than anything, but it really has changed the way we learn. Some professors ask if I can Google it, why do I teach it? Or students ask that sort of idea, and I think it's an interesting question. It's not probably, like we could sit here and stop the presentation right now and just debate that. That would be a fantastic debate. Like, are the things in my class things that I shouldn't be teaching anymore? Should I be just allowing other people to learn in different ways? What is the basis of my class if most of my class is mostly content? And I think that's a really important connection. Now, when we look at Tony Wagner, he addresses it slightly different. He says, today knowledge is like air, it's like water. There's no competitive advantage in knowing more than the person next to you. The world doesn't care what you know, the world cares about what you can do with what you know. And that's, of course, been a really important argument for applied arts and sciences for a very, very long time. But we can see that students are doing this. They're taking up, Tom Scott invited this student to his, don't worry about the audio at this point, to take up, he noticed that this author was creating some really interesting scientific concept. And so you see this kid.
This is Splenda. It's known as a zero-calorie sweetener or a healthy replacement for sugar.
Splenda no-calorie sweetener with the original sugar-like taste you love and trust.
But hold up, wait a minute. How is this even possible? Have you ever thought to yourself it's a little strange that a food has 0 calories? Can it even have that? Well, yes, it's theoretically possible. Think of it this way. If you say eat plastic, nothing really will happen. Plastic has 0 usable calories. If you eat it, you can't take energy from it. Don't eat plastic, by the way. This is just an example. So before answering how many calories Splenda really has, if any, we first have to answer if Splenda has any usable calories at all. How do we do that? Well, when we eat and digest sugar, or sucrose, our body turns it into glucose and fructose.
So I won't go through the whole video, but you can get a sense of how this kid is taking on some of these really interesting challenges and explaining it in a way that a professor might or someone for his students, but taking up a challenge of being able to develop videos like this. And you see this right across YouTube. Young vloggers taking up really interesting challenges of knowledge.
Thank you.
What's also interesting, of course, besides this abundance of content, we see this abundance of tools that we've seen. Now, we see tools in some negative ways, obviously. Tools shape our behaviors. Marshall McLuhan, the famous Canadian from the 1960s, media theorist, the term that was often used, it's misphrased a bit, but we shape our tools and then our tools shape us. This idea that all the technologies we adopt ultimately changed our societies and us as individuals as well. And it's one of the bases for media theory. But you look at examples like this and you see that people may not be paying attention in class or just in life in general. We see that we make accommodations in big ways. This is actually from a Chinese street where they have actually decided to create texting lanes to make sure that people aren't walking into these mindless zombies as they walk across these paths. But you see this across the world where in Germany, I recently saw a story about how they've embedded traffic lights into the sidewalk itself, so you could look down and know when to cross the street. So how much are we bending over for technology versus deciding it to run its course our way as well? And I think that's really an important idea. But tech can certainly inspire poor habits of mind, and that's one of the problems that we have certainly in our classroom. So for instance, you've probably seen this many times, or this sort of process, and I thought there was a really interesting comment from one of our earlier speakers on how sometimes we don't think. We can solve problems without thinking, or if there's not rigor or effort in the way that we actually do work in class, that we're not going to remember. So this is probably one of the poorer examples of how we might take up technology in the classroom. In fact, we know that this leads to less memorization. We know that about experiences too. If you're taking photographs, you're much less likely to remember the experience. There's a lot of research backing that up. When we look at sort of this idea of SAMR, and I'm assuming a lot of people probably have some knowledge of SAMR, it's a good framework for understanding the ways that we use technology in particular. So for instance, in this case, that previous picture might not even be seen as a good substitution. So we're at the very lowest levels of how we might use technology. And ultimately, we want to get to the point where we redefine. This idea, technology in some way has actually helped us to redefine what we're trying to in the classroom. It's no longer a replacement or an augmentation, because we know that it takes power, it takes work to actually include technology in a class, that we have to go beyond that. One good example of where we're sort of offloading our computational thinking, this is an example of an app out there called Photomath. And Photomath is one that you can basically, if you're looking at a mathematical problem in front of you, you can take a photograph of it and it'll actually do the work for you. Now this has led to all sorts of children out there actually helping out their friends and saying, hey, you want to learn a new way to cheat on your homework? Here's a good example. So I'll show you this kid who's decided to help out his peers. Oops.
Hey guys, so I'm going to be showing you how to cheat on your homework, but just don't try this. Basically, if you go on the App Store, you'll see an app called Photomath, basically download it, and it can solve your maths problems for you. So if I flip this, you'll see that on this phone I have the app, and then I have some problems on this piece of paper. If I put on 2 times 7, it'll bring it up, and it will say 2 times 7 equals 14, and it will say true. Then I have 8 times 4, it'll work it out, it says 32. And basically, you can use this with your homework if you're struggling on maths, but I do recommend it.
So you see an example of someone who's decided he's going to make a way, help his friends out this way. But we could even go beyond that. Like besides the tools actually doing the things that we used to develop skills for in class, there's even a new app that some of my students have taken up, something called HW Pick. So just send a picture up of any problem that you might have in class, and these mentors out there who will do this for a small fee, who are probably grad students looking for jobs for the most part, they actually will send, they're actually highly skilled people who will actually send back information. Now, if you're lucky, you'll get someone who's actually helps you through the process and helps you as a teacher would, rather than give you just the answer, but that doesn't always happen in these cases. So when we think about it, there's a really interesting video by a guy by the name of John Drone from Athabasca University. So you can search for this if you want, or I can give you access to these slides. But he talks about the idea of technology, and he's using the example of a stick. A stick can be or technology typically can be seen as a soft technology or a hard technology. A soft technology is something where the technology really exists in your mind. So a soft technology doesn't have a particular purpose. You can use it as leverage, you can poke someone at it, you can use it as a weapon, you can do whatever you want with it. But ultimately, the technology exists in your mind versus, say, a refrigerator. You're not going to do much more than refrigerate your food in a refrigerator. So the idea of soft technologies are really important when we're able to adapt and make them something new, where the invention happens in our brains. So I'll give you an example. One of the first that I remember from one of the very first videos I've ever saw on YouTube was this called Amateur. And basically what you see here is someone who is showing us, he doesn't know how to play piano, he doesn't know how to play drums, but what he does know how to do is video editing. So he's taking video editing technology to help him become a musician. So what you'll see in a second is what he does is he hits the drums, and everyone is a cut. And so he doesn't actually play, but what he's playing through video editing in that sense. Can I get you to scrub a little bit? And as you go through this video, you can see, and if you go about 3/4, about there, a little bit later, a little bit more. 3/4 right across the screen. Keep on going, keep on going. A little bit more, like right across, until he's on piano. There you go. And just let it go down. So you can actually see, because it's technology, he can also do this with piano when he's accompanying himself. And you go right to the end, the very, very last frame. Oh, that's all right. At the end frame, what he says is basically, I don't know how to play piano and I don't know how to play guitar. All of these sounds are from the original tape. But it's really interesting that he doesn't call himself a musician, but what he's ultimately become is a musician of sorts. And it's interesting how the technology has redefined what he's able to do. So moving ahead, this idea of networks, and I think Kathy Cronin will talk more about this tomorrow, but this idea that when we look at this new form of networks that have really allowed us to connect in new ways, and there was lots of talk around that today with many people. So we come from pedagogies of isolation versus sort of the pedagogies of abundance in some ways. When we look at this, these are old French depictions of what it would look like in the future to what technology could look like in the future for helping us learn. In the early 1900s, this was an example of a device that people created because we'd have so many different types of distractions. I'm not sure what the distractions were back then, but I love the disclaimer at the bottom that this would allow you to only look at one slit of text, or one line of text at a time. And it was to keep us from being so distracted by so much text on a page. And this is an example. This is from Malaysia. This is one example here of anti-cheating devices, basically. So it's really kind of an interesting idea. But this is really mind your own business learning. We think very much about individual achievement versus this idea of group achievement or going beyond individual achievement and learning. And this is something, even with technology, it's happened over a long time. If you look at computer-aided instruction in the 1960s, again, very individually focused. Even today, if you look at most of the way that we run courses, we're very much focused on the individual. Even if everyone has a network, a laptop, and we're connected together, what they're doing on those devices is very much individually focused, because achievement in our society is mostly individual focused for the most part. And then we look at even technologies that drive us, that keep us that way. So you've heard of LMSs. I'm not sure if, learning management systems. But my students, we did a critical discussion of learning management systems, and they told me their top assumptions about when they think about learning management systems, what it actually means to them. And you can certainly go out of them and do different things, but for my students' experience, they saw that learner management is a synonym for teaching. They felt that, and this is mostly very cynical, learning means the consumption of information. Learning happens best in institution-controlled closed spaces. The most valuable learning is that which can be quantified. Discussion forums are communities, and learner contributions are expendable, and learning is orderly, learning is linear. And that's what students are sometimes told, that this is what learning means for me in the institution. Many of you, and I saw the rich examples today of people who are going beyond these restrictions, but out of the box, sometimes we have to be very cynical about what we're actually telling students learning might be. What we're seeing, and this has been the rise of the web, we saw this idea of micro-participation. And this is one of these first metaphors I saw from the early social web, was this idea that this was Eric Whitaker, a composer who put out YouTube videos to get people to sing and then send him videos. And what he created was this really interesting virtual choir where people sang together, and he brought them all in unison. And it was a beautiful metaphor for what we could do on the web. If we all just provide individual contributions, we can build something beautiful together. And I saw that in my classes. I would build, whenever I wanted to do something, I would put out a Google Doc out to my network on Twitter. And this was one example when a student asked me, they didn't have any inspiration for the blog posts I was asking my student to do. And so I put out a blank document, and my Twitter followers just filled this out. And we watched this in amazement as it was filled out. I've also benefited in other ways. When I applied for tenure 12 years ago, I guess, or 10 years ago, I decided to put my CV out there so that everyone in the world could see and then judge me in that way. But what happened, and people would send me edits. They said, oh, you have a spelling error here. Oh, you missed this presentation, or you missed this paper. And it was really interesting to see that people actually advised me to produce a better app. But not only that, one professor that I didn't know real well back then, John Becker from Virginia Commonwealth University, he decided to put out a poll. He asked the question, what have I learned from Alec Kouros? And he solicited answers, sent a letter to my dean, kind of aggregated them all, and I was fortunate to get tenure and promotion that year. But it was really interesting to see that this thing happened out of nowhere, that just basically putting out my information allowed enough people to trust in me to provide more information, to provide me with some really rich feedback, unsolicited, that my dean and search committees received. So in the last few years, we've seen this reemergence of social learning. Gardner Campbell presented this idea that we came from a Cartesian view of learning, knowledge as substance and pedagogy as knowledge transfer, and we've seen a lot of that in the past century, to this idea of the social view of learning. We participate, therefore we are, understanding as socially constructed. And one of my favorite examples of this, again from the early web, was this young boy. He's in 8th grade. He decided, rather than just to search things on Google, he decided, I'm going to ask my question. So he's taking his homework. In this case, the homework was he had to create fire with something called a bow drill. So I've never seen this before, but basically it's sort of like rubbing sticks together to create fire. Rather than Googling it, he just created a video to ask YouTube what they thought about this project.
Hello, I'm trying my hardest here to make a bow drill set. See this is my spindle, and this is my block that you put on the top. So when you're spinning it around like that, so it won't melt into your hand. And then this is the bow that I use, and I just use some paracord, nylon paracord. And then this is the hearth that's made out of yellow cedar. The hole is right there, and I tried another hole, but that was too deep, so it didn't really work. And then this is the tinder, it's just normal dry lint. And I'm going to show you how I do it. And I'm doing it wrong, I know I am. And please comment down below so you can teach me how to do it.
So you can see he's got about 50,000 comments
this
with
is
50,000 views,
another
which I
part.
think is great. And some of the comments that actually came in were fantastic. Like, I'm sitting here with my 4 friends, and we all bow drill, which I thought was amazing because I don't know one person across the planet that bow drills. And somehow this kid was, like, this is the long tail, if you've ever seen this idea, that you can find these little communities of people who like something. And I love this idea because he was able to do this. He knew how to hashtag it and make it relevant in search. People found the video, he helped him, they helped him, and he was able to take on this project really quickly. And the comments were incredibly nice and collaborative and really kind, which we don't always see in YouTube. So it was kind of the promise of the early web. So the question that I've been asking for the last few years as I continue to teach, how do we leverage the affordances of this new digital culture, this idea of abundant content, new tools that change us in both positive and negative ways, but give us new capacity, and this beautiful aspect of the social web, these networks that allow us to connect in different ways. And how do we do this in authentic, engaging, relevant, and caring ways? And I think this caring part is, there's a cat in here. And I think that's a big part of it. So in some of my work that I've done, designing for active social environments has been a really big part of what I do in my classes. And a lot of this is around the concept of the unbound classroom, the classroom that's not bound by walls, that basically has really some boundaries when we need boundaries, but no boundaries when we don't need those boundaries, when they actually help us. And a lot of my stuff is really around the National Council for Teachers of English, the framework for 21st century learning. Many of these were echoed today, this idea that we need to have our students' proficiency with the tools of tech, to build relationships. We want students to be able to do that. I love this one, to design and share information for global communities. And we often just, we think about students developing things for us or for our assessments, but ultimately it's important that students' work should be able to be vetted by the world. We should be proud to be able to allow students to be able to do this. To critique and analyze multimedia text to get away from text, and of course to think about the ethical responsibilities. So I see as courses in some of the early work that I did, courses at global events. So in 2007, I thought of this crazy idea to basically put one of my students out there. So students would be blogging in the open. I created an open call for network mentors, so people around the world could be mentors to my students. And I thought only a few would pop up. There's 20 students, but I put out a trailer of my class, and it was a tech course in this case. But you can see the trailer I put out to get people from the outside engaged. So I invited students to come to that course. I had 20 students only at the time, and I ended up with 200 mentors, which is a really odd ratio if you've ever 10 mentors to one student, which became a little overwhelming at times. But it was interesting. Some of them dropped off, and so it became but it was okay, but it was all right. And then, of course, rethinking course spaces and boundaries. And one of the big parts of my classes is to make sure students understand what it means to be able to speak in a global forum. So over time, from the classroom, we thin the walls to allow students to understand what it means to be in both private places, what conversations and what vulnerabilities we have in private spaces versus when we actually go into public spaces. So as an example, we use Moodle, but we have student-controlled spaces. Every student, because I think their work actually is valued, and it should value, and they should have some control of it. They have their own WordPress blogs. And then we, of course, as what previous presenter talked about, we have like a hashtag that we allow to participate there in Twitter as well. So again, hashtag, students will actually take care of the work. When I know that I've done a good job as an instructor, students will actually buy their own domain name, they'll actually keep their blog, they'll keep their work, they'll readapt it. They do something with it rather than us just deleting it over time. That's one example. And then I actually have every one of my students, all their work aggregated in the public. We buy both domain names for our work as well. So all the student work is actually aggregated and made public. And of course, we do some stuff behind doors, the more vulnerable conversations we have in the learning management system, but we make sure that there's a big public element as well. And then we rethink participation. And this is from my doctoral work many years ago, that we used to have these sort of very barren networks, that the networks weren't much at all, and we moved toward this idea of 21st century learning networks. And what's really more important about this idea, is that the people behind this, the connections that we get our students to connect with, that are professional connections, that can help students get employers, that can help students learn. That they're really authentic connections that can go well beyond the class. And that's a really big part of some of the classes that I teach. I'm going to just move ahead. And also the participation, or the types of things that students are expected to do in classes, is very different as well. Every semester, one of the key things in my syllabus is this idea that the important things, it's not a participation mark, it's contributions to the learning of others. So I ask students to make sure that they're commenting on each other's blogs, interacting with others, we use Google+, writing responses. And this is incredibly important. And at the end of the semester, students are actually asked to, things like this: rank your contributions to the learning of others, identify up to 3 students supported or enhanced by your learning. So we'll create like a Wordle, and I'll see sometimes students' names come up very big, like a cloud map. When I know that I've done a better job is that it's much more distributed equitably and no name comes up really, really strong. And so it's really interesting to see that happen from time to time. But not asking students to connect with others, I think it's something that we should do more often. Now I'm just going to move across a little bit and then get to this piece. Oh yeah. The next thing I did that I kind of learned a lot of this from was my MOOC experience. So I did create with some co-conspirators, I called them, develop a MOOC in 2013. It started out with a little tweet that I did from my car, and all of a sudden, I wasn't driving, but I did from my car at one point, and we ended up with, at the most, 12,000 people. Now, not all of them contributed in the same way, but we had, at one point, 12,000 people from 75 countries. And I knew one of the biggest things that was really important was to make sure that people had a sense of community and a sense of belonging. So one of the first things we did was get students to challenge them to a lip dub. So students who were enrolled in the course, we found a song, we decided to tick up the lyrics and sing. So each student would actually send videos to me, and they would send it to a Dropbox folder, and then I actually found someone on Twitter who would actually aggregate these together and create them into a new music video. And so this is an example of this lip dub, which was the first thing we did in class to really get students a sense of belonging and community and presence in the class. And I've done this in a number of non-MOOC classes ever since then, and others have taken up this same idea, but it brings people together in some interesting ways. Can you turn the volume up? Yeah. Is it all the way? Okay. Doesn't have to be that loud, but yeah.
Justin Bieber.
Oh, you can, yeah, fast forward a little bit, that's fine. And you can kind of see, you just scroll through it a little bit. You can see sort of the juxtaposition of a lot of different places. I'll stop right here. So we've got Uruguay, Vancouver, or just stop it, yeah. Red Deer, we've got Nunavut, our northern province, Adelaide, St. Louis, US. And it's really interesting to see them connect in different ways and get to know each other. But it was one of those most impactful things that, if you actually look at this community, this class was supposed to be only 10 weeks, and students, this is 2013, and students still connect after all these years. It was one of those things that really created a powerful experience. And so this is one of the things I'm really proud of. So we'll just move to the next slide. And if you want to do one on your own, you can just Google it. There's actually a tutorial on how to do the same thing as well. Also, this idea of rethinking assessments. I'm a big fan of new literacy studies that really looks at this idea of embracing text in audio and visual media, getting students to do things differently, and actually develop and think about what students are bringing to the domain. Like someone mentioned that students are digital natives today. Well, how do they actually look at developing media in ways that they haven't before? So I'll give you examples of this. One of the things that I do in all of my classes is we do a summary of learning, what they actually have to take. They have to take their learning for the semester and actually develop a video or an audio or some multimedia artifact that actually shows what they've done. And we learn this concept from a lot of videos that we saw online. So this is an example of a book narrative in 1 minute that we saw that sort of engaged us in this. So this is Forrest Gump in 1 minute. Audio?
Of my life, because I'm simple. When I was young, I had to wear special shoes, and I met a girl called Jenny, and through some miracle, I didn't need my special shoes no more. I ran so well, I played football. I got to meet the President of the United States. And then Jenny came back, but she left again. Then I went to Vietnam, and I met Lieutenant Dan. Unfortunately, my bestest good friend Bubba died. I promised him that I'd be the captain of a shrimp boat, and I got good at ping pong, and I went to China. Then I was a shrimp boat captain with Lieutenant Dan. And then I had to go back home because my mama died. Then Jenny came back, she left again. Then I went for a long run, people followed me. Then Jenny told me that I was a daddy. So we got married. Then Jenny died. Then little Forrest went off for his first day of school. Life is like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're gonna get.
So there's a lot of these out there that are really quite inspiring. One of my students decided to do his summary of learning for the class in sort of an animation format. So here's what that looks like. So a student who was really big into Photoshop, and he wanted to do animations, and so he thought that video game, like an old school video game, would be the way that he would do it.
No.
And see, that was the class that I taught. It's an undergraduate class at the time.
I guess one shot then. Power on. Life is good. What?
Not sure if you've ever done that before, but that was the way it fixed it, yeah. So this is him right there, you can see, and this is him going through the class, but it's represented as a video game, and that's, again, him, 3 lives. And so as he goes through the class, these are certain things that, like literature that we read, things that we did, projects in class. Those were 2 of his really important colleagues in the class. And then if you kind of scroll through a little bit, that's all right. If you scroll through a bit, sorry. Yeah, scroll through. Is it stuck? Yeah, there you go. You can kind of see he goes through the entire thing, keep on going, and he kind of goes through it, and then he goes slower through the whole thing, and he talks more deeply around what everything meant to him in the class. One other good example of this, and I'll just go to the next, those are people that he met on Twitter. This is another good example of students who wanted to take it on in a song format. So they recall the class, but they do this again in a multimedia format. I'll just need audio for this one as well.
Feeling our way through the darkness, not too sure where to start. We don't know where our journey will end, but Ecomp has made us smart. Twitter used to be so hard to understand. Using it was just a dream. But then Alec Kouros came and opened up our eyes and taught us to be a team. So we blogged, tweeted, and...
You get into really some high notes later, so I want to share you, keep you from those. But they're not real great singers, but they had a lot of fun through that. But they vlogged throughout the semester to learn different things. But we also did something called the Learning Project. This is one of my favorite projects in class. This idea that that for the most part, a lot of our learning is invisible. And Albert Bandura, who basically created the area of social learning, I love his quote here. You can read the whole thing. But people see the extraordinary feats of others, but not the unwavering commitment and countless hours of perseverant effort that produced them. This idea that we want to make students' learning visible is really incredibly important. And getting them to understand that to learn something takes a lot of effort. So this idea, in short, is this idea that success is much more a windy path than just a direct arrow in many ways. So what students do in my class is they pick up something that they've always wanted to learn but have never been given the institutional space to learn. And I love this. So students who, like this is an engineering student who's taking up ukulele, English student who's taking up ASL in this case. This is a math student who's taking up in this case, painting. So I don't know how to do any of these things. Students take on different languages, but the main thing is that they're actually sharing and documenting their process. And then I usually try to find some way of verifying that they're not just, like if one student took up Japanese, so I wanted to make sure that I found someone out there that actually speaks Japanese that can test it. So this is a student who shared with me their process.
I'm glad you could join me.
Since I can't find, since I don't paint myself, there's lots of Bob Ross videos out there, so he found lots of Bob Ross videos. And then students would create these videos or other sort of reflections over time to actually show what they learned in class. So this is an example of a weekly contribution to show me what he's actually learning about painting in class. Really great example of someone who's not from the art field taking up something very different in class and been given the space to do that over time. I want to just finish with this idea of nurturing positive participation. One of the things is not just to learn online, but the web is a reflection of our lives, a reflection of our society in many ways. And sometimes it's a very negative reflection. And so taking on some really important tasks online is really important. Someone mentioned this morning this idea of, the activism. Activism on web is not really activism at all, and I think that's a really important idea, that students understand that doing something different, actions don't speak louder than like buttons, and this is really important to a lot of what students take up. So for instance, we can throw money at a problem. This is an example of one of these really negative videos that was out there. This was a 70-some-year-old bus monitor. She was doing her job on a bus where these middle school kids started yelling at her. They put it on YouTube. They made her embarrassed. They bullied her. She was crying. It was like a horrible video. And then one of these really feel-good stories is, someone sees this thing happening out there, and then to try to raise her $5,000, they ended up raising $681,000, and she ended up retiring and feeling a lot happier with her life. So it ended up being in a good way, but it's not really getting to the root of the problem. There's lots of other great examples too of these really great everyday stories, and this is one that stuck with me. I saw someone on a social network called Reddit, a dad who lost his son, basically posted this really nice photograph online, and basically he was asking, the question was, here's my photo of my son shortly before he passed away from cancer. can anyone take this photograph and actually create a really nice minimalist rendition of it? So he wanted something that, sort of a different memento, although the picture's beautiful in itself. But people changed it, and then at some point they started drawing and doing some really beautiful things with it. And I was really, I remember seeing this and all of these really beautiful examples, but they were all shared, and you could see the sentiments of this dad sort of sharing this online, and it was one of these beautiful places. And the web is not really always a beautiful place. It can be a very toxic place, but seeing this kind of gives you hope. And I remember seeing this and looking at it, and I don't know who this person is, but I'm like tearing up in my room. My 10-year-old daughter at the time, she's like, "Dad, are you crying on the internet again?" And it was just one of these things, that these are the types of things I want to share with my students, just the beautiful conversations. So a big part of all of this, like media and text and technology and all this stuff, doesn't matter unless we can think about the way that it runs through in our courses through this idea of citizenship. Joel Westheimer talks about this idea, Westheimer and Kane, when we think about the types of citizenship. Personally responsible, participatory and justice-oriented. Personally responsible, if you're on the net and it's sort of like mowing your lawn and paying your taxes. You do the least citizenship that you can possibly do. Then there's this idea, and we're thinking about digital citizenship in this case, participatory. You may develop and or share petitions, you actively share and create information for the social good. That's great. But thinking about justice-oriented citizenship, this idea of getting to root causes, and that's such an important piece of what we don't do, or we don't typically take up in a lot of classes. So this is, again, one of these important pieces to think about. And then moving on, and just to conclude, what I love about this particular quote is this is Barry Wellman, who back in 2002, before the social web even began, talked about this idea that we're in the midst of a paradigm shift in both in the ways and people and institutions are connected. It is a shift from being bound up in homogenous little boxes to surfing life through diffuse, variegated social networks. And to think about what this looks like, most of our institutions, our classrooms are in these little boxes. If we start to bring in the internet in some ways, in classes, get rid of the boundaries of our classes, we might look at localization, but ultimately our students have to thrive in an increasingly networked world. And so moving towards this idea of networked individualism is a big part of it. And to do this in ethical ways, and I love this is actually an example of my dad shortly before he passed away, and my kids, connecting. One of the most important parts of all of this is not connecting to information, but connecting to each other. And I think this is such an undervalued thing that we do in some of our classes. And so just to finish off, there's a really fantastic video which kind of connects all these ideas. This is a classroom of students in Brazil who are trying to learn English, and they thought they'd connect to a seniors home in the US, and it's just a beautiful project that ended up coming together.
We created a tool that connects our students with seniors in the USA living in retirement homes.
Hello.
Melissa.
Hi, Dick. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
How are you today?
I'm good. How are you?
It's the first time that I'm talking with someone from another country.
I'm very excited to be doing this.
I look like I'm only 25, but I'm 88.
Do you have sisters and brothers?
No, I'm one child.
Only one? Oh, you poor fella.
I'm live with my old brother. He has 23 years.
Do you know, instead of saying he has 23 years, you could say he is 23 years old.
I tried to go to Lollapalooza that we have next week, I think, in Brazil, but my mom didn't let me.
You got a good mom.
Good morning, dear Julia. Good morning to you.
This is your dad?
That's me and my wife when we were young.
Oh, you were good looking when you were young. And you're still good looking.
My first destiny is United States, of course, because I wanted to put better my English.
Well, you do very well, I must say.
Are you planning someday to go to Brazil?
Oh, I would like to.
You can stay in my house if you want.
If you could just dream and have whatever you want, what do you think you would like to be doing?
I see myself in a big family, with a beautiful wife.
I'm gonna have to edit here. video. It's one of those things that really bring together this idea of technology, humanity, and pedagogy. And I've already gone over, so I want to stop there, but thanks very much for listening.
Hello. Okay, I'm going to just ask tomorrow's keynote speaker, Catherine Cronin, to give a response, and then we'll open the floor to 1 or 2 questions.
Thank you, Maha. Alec, thank you so much. My overriding thought after hearing you speak is that many of us know the details and the facts about how our context is changing, but what you help to bring us is the emotion of that change. And it reminds me of how important the affective dimension of learning is, in how we support one another as faculty, but also with our students. So thank you for that. You spoke about... Something wrong, yeah.
Yeah.
Can I use another one? You want me to move? Okay. Now, is that better?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I loved how you spoke about marking students for their contribution to learning rather than participation. Still not working though. Stand right here. And how I understood that is that you're redefining participation in a digital networked age. So I think that's something that we could all learn from. So maybe a 2-part question. Assuming that many of us value the kind of work that you're showing, what do you think are the most important things we can do to support others who wish to make such changes, who are not doing it yet? Right. And perhaps even more importantly, higher education institutions are very slow to change. So what kinds of things can we do to help support institutional change?
So I think one of the projects I showed, just this idea of going back to learning how to learn is such an important piece of all of this. So there was actually an example, and I won't spend too much time on this idea, but going back to one of the examples, one of my co-instructors actually did the learning how to learn online, so he actually learned guitar online and started sharing videos of him. He's a fantastic instructor, he's a horrible guitar player. And that sort of idea of actually becoming a learner was so humbling for him. And I think a big part of what we do is that we're expertise in our field, where we feel competent as instructors, and all of a sudden this throws it off. So we're using technology, we're maybe being more of the effective idea. We're sort of being a bit more about our feelings rather than just sort of the content. And that's a paradigm shift for a lot of people. Or even this idea of opening up and moving from a teacher-centered classroom to a student-centered classroom where their contributions matter. I've changed my role drastically in the last few years to basically really depend on student evaluations, peer evaluations for students. And I've stepped back a bit. And that's really changed everything for me. I feel that I can continue to support students in a very different way. Like, how are you going to help me support students and support each other? But that's a huge paradigm shift. So having a strong CLT, of course, is a big part of that. But also allowing students, allowing our colleagues and faculty members at faculty meetings and other spaces, to making sure that we understand that we have support for the idea of experimentation. Like, I heard today so many different types of experimentation, and we have to allow that and make sure that we support it. And if we fall on our faces, that's what all this is about. Being able to experiment in public in some ways and not feel that we've failed. I think that's a big part of it. Thanks for the question. There's, sure. In the middle, yeah.
Hello, thank you for your talk. So you talked about 2 points that are of a great interest for me. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So 2 points that you mentioned already. One is the availability of content and knowledge
Content and knowledge, yeah.
Yeah, and the second one is about reevaluating what we take into the classroom regarding what is available or online already in the platforms. So taking these 2 points into account, yeah, this is better, I think, yeah. So how we can preserve the authenticity of the content.
Right. So one of the things I'm talking about tomorrow is actually a workshop on fake news and information literacy. And I've tweeted about this recently, that it's not just a checklist. So looking at lists of content and trying to verify how valid the information is not something that many of us can do. We may not have the subject knowledge, but this idea of truth finding or critical thinking is a disposition, it's a mindset, it's a habit of mind. So there's lots of ways. I'll talk about some of them tomorrow, but getting students to even be skeptical of the professor in front of them. Like, I think one of the critical thinking mindset is so much more important, and then the skills will come with that. Obviously, we have to present both at the same time, but there's lots of good examples that we can show students where they're poor examples of journals, poor examples of websites that don't have high quality content. And as we expose students to these things, we can help sort of make visible our processes for how do we know the content on this site how is valid, but also there's the newer examples, I guess. They talk about vertical or sort of lateral thinking. This idea that we as professors, we as students spend far too much time trying to verify content when we don't verify the content provider. And typically when we look actually at the web page or the site or the journal, we can spend, we look at fact checkers, for instance, who actually step off the page. They don't look at the content and they say, what do we know about this content provider? And then go back to the content itself. So if we do that, we actually save time, or we're more accurate in terms of actually looking at what's good content, what's bad content. So there's making those processes open, and even thinking about what other people have to say about that same content is really important. So creating trusted networks of quality consideration, I guess, would be part of that. So that's part of it. Lots of content, very difficult to evaluate the worth of it, and we have to do that, whether it's scientific or literature or whatever it might be. Thanks. Good. Thanks.
One more question? One more question. Alec is also here tomorrow all day, and he's giving a workshop.
Yeah.
From 2 to 3:30.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much.
All right.